Welcome to Sorbonne, welcome to the University of Paris, although you probably know that this building is the Faculty of Law, which wasn't part of the University of Paris until 1809. Well, let me first thank you for answering my call to think together about foundations, rather fuzzy term at the moment, but I will try to make it a bit clearer. Then let me thank you for traveling to Paris, and thank you for being here today. I would like to introduce our workshop today with an attempt at defining our program. You probably all noticed how wide the proposed subject is, with reference to various time and places, medieval Europe with Tilman Lohse, modern Sahara with Ismail Warscheid, then contemporary Middle East with Randy de Guilhem, and eventually present New Zealand with Hussein Ben Younis. So this is an ordering of topics, but I might also order the speakers in alphabetical order, okay? So you can track them on the same map. And of course, New Zealand is a bit far away from the Mediterranean, but this might be this comprehensive program might be at risk with a French saying, which is "Qui trop embrasse mal étreint." That is to say, grasp all, lose all. And as an introduction to this workshop, I would like to make a bit clearer the rationale for collecting examples of OCAF or Stiftungen or foundations or fondations or whatever way you call them. The point today is not, at any rate, to define a general typology of foundational forms, okay, and there are many of them, of course, across time and space, and this would require a legal historical inquiry into the origins, which dates back at least to the Roman Republic and the Fideicommissium, or even before, then an encyclopedic survey across countries, etc. But instead of this, I would like to invite you to consider common features among these foundational forms. And it seems to me that the heart of our subject is that the foundations are incorporated property that does not belong to somebody, and which is rather offered to a mission, a self-sustaining, self-reliant mission. So if we agree to this definition, then these OCAF, these Stiftungen, these foundations, we will call them more generally non-owned purposive property, non-owned purposive sustainable property. And such definition would draw definitely a line between foundations and Fideicommissium in Europe, between Stiftungen and Majorate, between different kinds of OCAF, because sometimes I came across that distinction between religious work on the one hand and family work on the other hand. Well, today we will be concerned chiefly with the former, I mean the religious, not the religious, but the non-owned purposive foundations, non-owned purposive property. And the reason why I'm trying to focus on this is not just that this inquiry is interesting in itself, because it's providing us with a view at an instrument which is effective beyond the horizon of life. In fact, I would like to stress the specific importance of looking at foundations in the French context. There is something of a French bias against foundation, which I would like to develop a bit as a matter of introduction. And it is quite common to attribute this mistrust for foundation in France to the French Revolution and the so-called Jacobin doctrine. Basically, the Jacobin doctrine is a doctrine which is supporting or sporting extensive government intervention to transform society. There are some instances, some good examples of how the French Revolution disrupted the existing foundation, so that the state became in charge of most social deeds after the revolution. For instance, the religious foundations were abolished by a decree of the National Constituent Assembly of November 1789. That means only right at the beginning of the French Revolution, the religious foundations were dissolved. Then the civil foundation were disrupted too, because there is nothing as a foundation in the Code Civil, which means that nobody could create new foundations after 1804. In order to incorporate property, you had to rely either on commercial chartered company, which had to be authorized by the state, or on civil society, which do not have, in fact, you know, la personnalité juridique. So they did not legally exist. In fact, they were not distinct from their creator. And moreover, in fact, the French Revolution changed the inheritance law so that it became so egalitarian, so that there was no mean to create by you know, living will, by your will, a special body that might be distinct from what you give to your children. So, at any rate, the French Revolution disrupted the existing foundation and did not create a space for new foundations to be created. So this view more or less equate foundation with Ancien Régime, and there is an implicit idea behind this view, which is that the state has to be the only provider of welfare to citizens. So the revolutionary Jacobins then somewhat anticipated the welfare state, and probably 1984-like welfare state, which was also the invention of totalitarianism, of course, because there was no private initiative outside from the state. In fact, a closer look at the French story the French history shows that mistrust for foundations predates the French Revolution. In fact, not just at French history, because if we look, for instance, at the English history, there were provisions, for instance, in the there were provisions, for instance, in the statutes of Mortmain in England during the 13th century, provisions that limited the church holding of property and the possibility for people to donate to the church. During the 15th, 16th and 17th century in France, the same kind of legal provisions were created to in fact make it harder to donate to religious institution. For instance, as soon as the 1619th, the religious institutions were prohibited from receiving legacies, and the so-called religious dowries, which were given to the young people that became monks or nuns. They had to give a dowry to the monastery they were going to. These dowry were limited to life annuities that were not capitalizable. Plus, the brotherhoods have been stripped of their capital from the middle of the 16th century on, which means that the capital of the so-called brotherhoods were given away. So there might be also the French bias against foundation might also originate into absolutism, and this is you probably know the Richelieu's triple portrait, which is at the National Gallery of London, and Richelieu has been the rector of the Sorbonne University, so of course we can only think that what he did was good, but maybe we shall inquire a bit more into this absolutist anti-foundational bias, because if we look at what happened during this 16th and 17th century, the point was not for the king to confiscate the estate of the foundation, as Henry VIII did in Britain with the act of dissolution of the monastery. The point was more about a concern that giving to religious foundation would freeze the money, would freeze the capital, and so the French theorists were more concerned with the idea that money has to flow in the economy for the economy to be working well. And so Colbert, who opposed clearly the religious foundation, his point was not to disrupt the religion, his point was not to get the money, his point that the money has to flow so that the economic activity would be better. And so he prohibited legacies to religious foundation on this ground. He prohibited religious dowries to be something else than life annuities on this ground, which is which means he did not want the religious foundation to have capital, but they could have revenue, income that they could spend. And the same applied, in fact, before Colbert with Michel de l'Hôpital, who wrote the Ordonnance d'Orléans in 1561, dissolving giving away the capital, the capital of brotherhoods, and this capital was given away either as alms or as wages for schoolmasters, which means again that capital has to be given away as a flow in order to fund activity, and hence the French absolutist bias against foundation is not a bias against foundation in general, but it's a bias against capital stock and in favor of flow of expense. So in some respect, it's an anti-capitalist, or shall I say, anti-capitalization bias. That's Colbert. So this is quite funny because you probably know that today the French advocate for more spending and less concern about public debt, etc. So there's still something about, and moreover, the French really oppose a stock view of social security. They don't want pension fund. They don't want capitalization for private insurance. The French want a system where people pay, and that makes the expenses of the system more tax-funded system. So it has something to do with the refusal of self-sustainable and bodies which rely on a capital. So I have first recalled how uncommon non-own purposive property is in the French mental catalogue of useful social institution, and the aim of our workshop today will be to describe the social usefulness of these foundation-like entities, which is especially precious for the French public, and especially in a time where the state intervention is being questioned on various grounds. On the one hand, because the public debt being so large, the state does not have means to spend more, but on other ground also because there seems to be now a lack of both scientific and political justification to the state spending more. So it seems important to document instruments of social intervention which can be either alternative or complementary to the state intervention. So this program, which is aimed at just describing, might be modest from a scientific point of view, because we're not concerned with theorizing or modeling or whatever. But in fact, our point will be to document self-reliant or sustainable projects, which are quite far away from the French way of thinking at social intervention. So, dear colleagues, it is up to you now to show us this institution which enabled people to fulfill, to perpetuate missions they thought important. Randy and Ismail will introduce striking example of OCAF surviving extreme social changes. I mean, colonization and decolonization, in stark contrast with Paul Valéry's statement that we know civilizations are mortal, okay? In fact, maybe civilizations are mortal, but under some circumstances, OCAF or foundations are not. Hence, we are concerned with something which is surviving social changes, and that's why I think it's especially interesting to look at these institutions. And I thank you to give us your knowledge of example you came across in your historical research. So while I invite Randy and Ismail to take a seat at the tribune, I would like to thank you for your benevolent attention.